Welcome to today's technical seminar brought to you by GIZ Fabric. My name is Stephen Frost. I'm your moderator, and I'll give a short introduction and then I will hand over to Marianne Gruber, who is the expert who will be conducting this session, the training. Let me just begin. You've all seen the invitation, and so you know what this is about, and you've seen Marianne's bio, so you have some idea of who Marianne is as well. So I'm not going to just repeat that, but let me just give you a little bit of background about why we're doing this. For many years, maybe 20 years. But increasingly so over the years, it's become clear to me that in the world of sustainability communication, manufacturers in the apparel and textile sector have generally not been effectively communicating what they do when it comes to sustainability. Now, I'm not saying that you're not sustainable. What I'm saying is that often when I see manufacturers communicate their sustainability to fashion brands and retailers, that is their clients, the communications often miss the mark, mainly because a lot of manufacturers are not entirely clear about what retailers and fashion brands want to see. So there's sort of a mismatch going on in the supply chain. You've got the brands and retailers, your clients, often reporting on their CSR, on their sustainability. And then a lot of reliance on getting information from audits, multiple audits. And that tends to be how most retailers or brands discover what's going on in your factories when it comes to sustainability, social and environmental performance. However, I believe that it would be beneficial for manufacturers to be much more proactive in this relationship. I think manufacturers would benefit if they were able to communicate effectively what they're doing to the brands. Be more proactive, be more active in the relationship, and provide the brands with information without the brands having to do audits or to ask for that information. So I think it's a selling point. I think it's a business. I think it's a business proposition that not just to communicate on your quality, your pricing, your delivery, all those other things, but also to be able to communicate effectively on sustainability. So in light of that, what we decided to do is run this technical seminar and invite someone along who has vast experience in report writing. So Marianne, whom I'll hand over to in a moment. You can see her bio at the bottom of the invite. But she's an experienced trainer. She's been in this business for 20 years. She's written numerous CSR sustainability reports across all industries. She's a great communicator. She's a great trainer. She's a certified GRI partner, a training partner. She's not going to just talk about GRI. She's a part of the GRI community member, but she's also involved with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She's an expert on the SDGs when it comes to reporting. So there's a bit of everything in the training today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marianne, who will speak for around 60 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. But if you do have questions during the talk, please just type them into the chat box. You'll see there's a chat box on the WebEx. Just type your questions into the chat box. If there's anything urgent, I will, I can feed that to Marianne as we go along. But otherwise, we'll have a Q&A for 30 minutes at the end. Okay, that's more than enough from me. Over to you, Marianne.
Great. Thanks very much for that great intro, Stephen. Much appreciated. And welcome, everyone. So I hope that you enjoy, I was going to say tonight's session because it's evening where I am, but today's session for where you are. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about sustainability communication, including sustainability reporting, and not just looking at the buyer aspects of sustainability reporting, but really having a look at, well, how can you contribute to their sustainability credentials as well? What tools are available to you and what steps you might want to consider? So let us get on with this. Bear with me for just one moment. So we are covering off quite a bit in this next hour. So it looks a little bit more onerous than it actually is. But these are all of the things that we will be talking about tonight. And look, let's actually get started. So look, no matter who the audience is and no matter what the level of understanding of sustainability or sustainable development is, I always do like to start with the definition of what is sustainability, because that really does set the scene for not just what we're going to be talking about, but also, just try and plant the seeds for looking at sustainability beyond, the old school way of thinking, which is environmental sustainability. So this is a tried and true model of sustainability where we look at economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. And we have a definition here which we can see, which came from, look, this was actually coined back in 1987 through the Brundtland Report. And the Brundtland Report was actually the outcome of a conference that was held in Belgium all those years ago, where sustainable development was talked about in this way. It was really looking at the intersection between economic, environmental, and social sustainability, and it still resonates very much today. So that definition, which is, 20, 30 years ago, is actually still used as the definition of sustainability today. So we look at sustainable development being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. So we're talking about intergenerational equity. We're wanting to make sure that your kids, their kids have got access to clean water, clean air, resources, so that we can actually, give them the life that perhaps our generation had. And we can certainly see that things are, that environmental and social issues are really top of mind now in terms of some significant negative impacts around the world. So one of the important things to note, and again, acknowledging the fact that you may very well be aware of this, but when we're talking about sustainable development, we use the words sustainability, sustainable development, CSR, as in corporate social responsibility, ESG, as in environment, social and governance. We use those interchangeably in the sustainability world. The reason why all of those terms are exist is basically, it's a point in time and different audiences coming into the sustainability field of interest, essentially. And so we have our three spheres of sustainability here, and right in the middle there is the intersection of all of these, where we are, trying to achieve an optimal level of sustainability, where we want to have equal economic, environmental, and social sustainability. So anyway, so that's just something to kind of set us off, set us instead for what we're going to talk about next. So, okay, all right, now let's get to the serious stuff. So in terms of sustainability, and we're looking at the economic, environmental and social sustainability impacts of the fashion industry, as in textiles and garments, etc. Some research that I have found is really quite worrying, actually. So just in the last few years, there has been a lot of research done, particularly by some of the United Nations agency, on the impact of the fashion industry throughout the value chain on the environment and also on society. So we can see here some pretty alarming numbers, can't we? So the fashion industry at that global level contributes to 20% of the global water pollution. And in fact, some of the readings that through my readings there, I understand that in Bangladesh, 3 rivers have been declared dead, essentially through industrial water pollution, which is really quite alarming. So global water pollution, roughly about 10% of carbon dioxide emissions, which is most likely going to increase by 2050 as well. The manufacturing of clothing plus the end-to-end, not just the manufacturing, but also the end use and washing of clothing is a major contributor to microplastics entering the ocean. Again, the high percentage of materials that are actually made from plastic that goes into clothes, which is, which is in itself an environmental issue. A huge amount of water is used in the industry, by the fashion industry, annually, and particularly in the areas where you all operate there, water scarcity is a really big deal. So when you're looking at the fact that 93 billion cubic meters of water is used by the fashion industry annually, now this is actually a global figure, but acknowledging the fact that throughout the Asia Pacific region there are there are defined areas of water scarcity. There is, and also just the fact that I think it's roughly about 60% of all garments are manufactured in the Asia Pacific region. Then this is actually really quite worrying. And also just the waste impact, actually. So 85% of all textiles going to the dump each year. So what can we do about that? It's interesting, isn't it? And we'll have a look at the global value chain in just a moment there. So do you have any response? Do you have any leverage over that? Maybe, maybe not. That's something that we need to define. But as you can see here, there are some pretty significant negative environmental impacts of the fashion industry, and we all contribute to those just through the day-to-day operational activities. So the only way is up, really. Okay, let's have a look at some of the social impacts as well. And these are all related to human rights issues. And these are extremely, extremely pertinent at the moment. So there have been quite a lot of studies done. And in fact, there's a great study that was done by the International Labour Organization, which I believe that I have a reference to in the upcoming slides here, where some of the most pressing social impacts are inadequate wages, particularly for women, because women make up most of the larger proportion of workers within the garment industry. Very long hours in working conditions that are not good at all, and also serious health impacts which are due to chemicals used in production. So these are some identified social impacts which can be drawn out into human rights issues as well that we also need to consider. So this is that social sustainability side of things. Yep, so we've looked at our environmental sustainability impacts, which most of us can relate to. It tends to be a lot more visible to us, doesn't it? And it tends to be talked about a lot more than some of the social impacts, including the human rights issues. And it's interesting to note, I will go ahead and talk a little bit about various standards that are available to you, but the Global Reporting Initiative standards were updated towards the end of last year, actually, and their focus is on sustainability, economic, environmental, and social sustainability for people, including human rights. And so human rights is all pervasive in the GRI standards, which also happens to be the world's best practice standard for sustainability reporting. So it's used, it's the standard that actually is used by more than any by more businesses than any other standard. So we've got our environmental impacts and we have our social impacts. Okay, now, here we go. So here is the reference at the bottom of this slide here. And it was a report that was recently done by the International Labour Organization, and they looked at both environmental impacts and also some social impacts as well. But it was really interesting to drill down into what actual activities are causing these environmental impacts. And the report found that there was significant water use, agricultural water use through the cotton industry, freshwater, actual extraction from freshwater from water sources, which is leading to water scarcity, and also that chemicals use that we talked about as well, which results in significant industrial water pollution. And these are the outcomes of the activities of weaving, dyeing, and finishing processes in the textile manufacturing. So it's definitely something that does need to be top of mind there. Energy use, of course, is also a main environmental impact that was identified across these 4 countries. The textile waste that we've already talked about, and also the transport emissions. This is something that you know, as far as textile waste and transport emissions, these are ones that you may not necessarily have a whole lot of control over as, you know, as manufacturers of clothing. However, you still do need to be aware that they exist. So the main impacts within the manufacturing side of sustainability are the top 2 here. So water use, chemicals use, energy use. So definitely things that we need to be aware of here. And also when we think about, so just on the right hand side of this slide here, we have just a couple of interesting stats here. When you look at those environmental and social impacts that we've already had a look at, you know, the impact across the Asia Pacific region is so vast because of the mere fact that 60% of the garment and textile exports do come from this region, and also the great social impact and the great human cost that can sometimes happen is, you know, absolutely evident because of the vast amount of workers within the industry as well. So roughly about 40 million workers across this region, and this is only looking at Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So interesting. Okay, all right. So just drilling down a little bit further into the actual sustainability impacts within Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, this report singled out labour standards and worker safety, low wages, severe water pollution, and water security. So in these 4 countries here. So in terms of looking at some of the potential negative impacts that your companies may be contributing to, this is a starting point here, but we will absolutely go into more detail in terms of other topics that might actually relate to a negative impact that your business is causing or contributing to. Okay, now the good news is that, well, through all the bad news, there is some good news, and there's a real push by many organisations across the world to make the fashion industry much more sustainable. And so you may be familiar with some of these initiatives here. So we have our United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, the Ethical Fashion Initiative, the Fashion Pact, Cotton for Good, and Better Cotton as well. So it'd be interesting, you know, possibly when we chat later on, is to think about, well, how familiar are you with these initiatives here, and do they actually influence the way that you actually run your business in terms of environmental and social sustainability? So that would be very interesting for us to have a bit of a chat about. And also, what I will actually say is that with any of these initiatives, generally speaking, there will be some kind of a research and or an audit process which is based upon various environmental and social indicators which manufacturers or various actors within the supply chain will need to abide by in order to be able to prove that they are well, one, considering what their negative environmental and social impacts are, and two, are they providing evidence that they, to these organisations and also to their buyers, that they are striving to continuously improve throughout their operations on various environmental and social factors. Okay, so this is really quite interesting. It's not the nicest graphic in the whole world, but there is. But I think that this is actually very useful for us to consider here. So we have what we call the apparel global value chain. Now, what we can actually see is that your businesses are a significant part of this value chain in this production process before all of your product is sent off over to the buyers and the retailers, etc., etc. So we can actually have a look here. If we're having a look at, a few key elements of the value chain, we generally tend to look at the components such as the raw materials. So where do you source your materials from? Are they from sustainable sources, i.e., are they sourced from countries or regions, etc., that have the least environmental and have the least environmental impact, and so on. What are the working conditions like in terms of actually picking that raw material or growing that raw material, etc. So these are considerations that we need to keep top of mind. Then, of course, we have the component and subassembly of the garment or the item there, and then we have that final assembly. So through each part of this production process, we would be able to identify, if we were to go through a mapping process, we would be able to identify some potential environmental and social impacts underneath each of those key steps, wouldn't we? So while that's not necessarily the focus of this presentation here, it's just interesting for us to know that we are part of that bigger picture, but we need to really look at this from a granular perspective at each step of the value chain. So this is a lot of background in terms of trying to position sustainability for your organisations before we just so that we have that baseline knowledge of what sustainability is, and move forward to working out, well, how do we communicate it? So we have quite a bit to get through, and also noting the fact that this is a 1-hour presentation, so we study sustainability for 4 years, so this is definitely a very top line overview for you. Okay, so I have been told that these are some of your key customers here, and so there are some very well-known brands here, of course. Now, it's really quite interesting here in doing the research on these brands here. There was, for the most part, a really great commitment to sustainability. And by that, I mean, being able to identify what these organisations' environmental and sustainability impacts are, and communicating those impacts to their broader stakeholder groups. So these are the groups that I had a little bit of a look at, and I will actually say that some of these, most of these actually are really quite good at communicating sustainability. Some of these are much more experienced in communicating their sustainability than others. So, for example, if we had a look at H&M Group, for example, or Nike, just choosing two of these ones here. So they have been involved in sustainability reporting or communicating their sustainability for many, many years. So they're very experienced reporters, and they really know, and they're very mature as far as being able to identify and understand what their most negative sustainability impacts are. And then you have a look at a brand such as Zalando down the bottom here. They have only been communicating their sustainability performance for the last 2 years. But what they are showing is a true commitment to sustainability. And one of the main things that we really need to, and I'll take you through some examples of how some of these companies are reporting on their sustainability. But one of the key things that they do report on, and they all use, as well as a number of other frameworks which are dotted throughout the Global Reporting Initiative standards. And one of the disclosures, actually, it has actually grown in the last, with the update of the 2021 standards. The expectation is that these companies must describe what their supply chain looks like. And that was in the old version of these standards. In the new version, all of these organisations need to go a lot further and talk about their sustainability impacts, i.e. their impacts on the economy, the environment, and people, including human rights, to quite a detailed level throughout the entire value chain. So the focus is the focus is just so strong, and the scrutiny is going to get more and more. The scrutiny is on these organisations is just going to rise, and that means that there will be that trickle down effect from these organisations who are your buyers to you. So your performance affects their performance, essentially, in terms of being able to measure and monitor your environmental and sustainability impacts. Okay, so let's just have a look at some of these sustainability reports. So what I've done here is I've just had a quick look just to see how these companies are reporting. And the interesting thing is here, Stephen has let me know that, you know, quite often it's your information through audits that gets fed back to these companies here. And so your performance data will be fed into the overall whole data that's included within these sustainability reports. So H&M Group, again, you know, they've been quite a mature reporter for a really long time. If we have a look at some of the topics that they report on, so I've just taken a little bit of a snapshot here, which covers off both environmental and social impacts here. We can see that in this middle box here, that they talk about climate positive, so energy and emissions essentially, biodiversity, microfibers, water, chemicals, packaging, minimising waste. These are all of some of the key environmental impacts that we've already discussed in the last few slides. Yep. So these are a key focus for them because they realise that these are some of their main environmental important topics or material topics. They also focus on people, so fair and equal on the right hand side there. So they talk about human rights, they talk about, you know, quality of jobs, they talk about inclusion and diversity, etc., etc. So people features really quite heavily for the H&M Group as well. So that's the social component of sustainability. And then also there is a good section there on supply chain management, which of course includes you. Yep. So they need to describe what their supply chain looks like and how they manage their supply chain. And I've just noted here some of the frameworks that they use. So we'll talk about those a little bit later. So you may or may not be familiar with some of these standards and frameworks. Okay, let's have a look at Inditex. So this one here, so I've just taken a bit of a snapshot here of their sustainability roadmap because their annual report is about 800 pages long. So, so I just thought this would be really quite easy. It actually is about 800 pages long. I'm not kidding. Okay, so if we have a look at how they've set out their roadmap to sustainability, they're aiming for net zero emissions by 2040. And along the way there, from this year all the way through to 2040, so over the next 18 years or so, they'll be focusing on energy consumption. They'll be focusing on sustainable sources of cotton. They'll be focusing on zero waste, single-use plastics, collection of all packaging materials, polyester, sustainable sources for polyester and linen, reduction in water supply, etc. So you can actually see here that so you can see here that they have a progressive plan for improving their sustainability outcomes. And the interesting thing is that because you supply to Inditex, or you may supply to Inditex, then you will have an impact on these numbers. So where is the cotton that you work with sourced from? Where is the rayon that you use sourced from? What kind of energy do you use? And so on and so on. Yeah, so that's really quite interesting there. And actually, this was quite an interesting one for me to have a look at. So I'm a little bit of a standards and frameworks queen. However, there was a new one that I did come across, actually, which was this final one called RAFI, the Reporting and Assurance Frameworks Initiatives, which looks specifically at human rights. So it's a standard for human rights, which is quite interesting here as well. So anyway. Okay, so let's have a look at Nike. Now, Nike has actually been sustainability reporting for a very, very, very long time. So they are very mature reporters. And what we can see here is just a snapshot of their focus areas. It's quite interesting here. They seem to focus more on the people side of things, although that's only by subtopic there as well. But you can see that they focus on things such as health and safety, business diversity and inclusion, and so on and so on. They look at, as far as planet goes, carbon. They would have a net zero plan as well, wastewater and chemistry. So all of the things that we are starting to get a little bit more familiar with in this session here as well. And just a couple more here. Okay, so Lululemon. Okay, so these, let's have a look here at, so this is really quite interesting here as well. If we have a look at this first section on the right-hand side and the following, and the last section and the last line underneath Be Human. So people who make our products. So this was really quite interesting to me in terms of, are they focusing on you, for example? Are they focusing on the individual? Are they focusing on the company? The fact is that they are highlighting this as a key element of sustainability, of social sustainability. And then if we have a look at Be Planet, we can see some familiar topics here, familiar environmental topics such as sustainable products, climate action, circularity, water and chemistry, and waste and packaging. So it's really quite interesting here. In that we're starting to see quite a pattern amongst all of these companies about what they're reporting on. And what they're reporting on are the topics that is important to their stakeholders and also to their greater impacts on sustainability. And they include your impacts as well. Okay, just having a look at the Gap Inc. here as well. Just having a look at the right hand, oh, actually on the left hand side here. So we do have a section there on supply chain. Every report has to include information on the supply chain, and then we look at a lot of the same environmental issues. So relating to environmental sustainability on that right hand side, when we're looking at water stewardship, women and water, chemicals management, climate and energy, sustainable material sourcing, etc., etc. So there are, there are commonalities. There are massive commonalities between all of these companies and what their key focus areas are that they are communicating about in their sustainability report. I think this is the last one here, actually. So this is Zalando. So I've just taken a little bit of information here from them. So they are relatively new to reporting, from what I can tell, about 2 years in. And if we have a look at some of their key focus areas, they're looking at the carbon footprint, packaging, circularity as in waste, ethical standards, and so on. So it's quite interesting. I think that Zalando will develop quite a lot in communicating their sustainability impacts as they get more mature in this area. Okay. All right. So let's have a look at, well, I guess what we really need to think about here is, well, how do they actually know what to report on? And this is one of the things that you will need to really think about in terms of, well, what topics will you report on when you are starting to communicate your sustainability impact? So we have here, there are quite a number of slides here, so I certainly won't go through all of the topics by any means, but the next few slides relate to some research that was done by the Global Reporting Initiative quite some time ago, so about 9 years ago, actually, and it is still absolutely relevant based upon the readings that I've done on the fashion industry here as well. So, so this will be really quite interesting for you. Now, what they've actually done for us is that they've identified a topic, they've specified a subtopic underneath that main topic here, and then they look at which stakeholders. So they actually went out and did quite a lot of stakeholder engagement to determine what was important to that stakeholder group. Yeah. And the reason why we're looking at what's important to that stakeholder group is, if it's important to that stakeholder group, it should be important to the company's activities. Yep. So that's something that you will find out once you run through a process of communicating sustainability. So we won't go through everything here as well, but let's actually, if we have a look at, the general top line on the top line topics there on the left hand side. These are topics that we've already seen some of the buyers communicate very clearly in their report. So we're looking at material sourcing, we're looking at energy consumption, water management, wastewater treatment, etc. Greenhouse gas emissions, chemicals use and discharges, textile waste management, cotton sourcing strategies and policies, and so on. So, and there's so much more to this as well. So, and this was really quite interesting as well. If we have a look at this top, I actually thought this one was really quite interesting. So with relation to cotton sourcing strategy and policies, and we have a look at the actual topic specification, this is where a range of stakeholders wanted to know, so what was important to them as far as what they thought was, had the most impact, was the sourcing standards for things such as agricultural practices, fertilizers and pesticides, water and soil impacts, and water management. So you can see here that, we're drilling down very much into the supply chain and the impacts throughout the supply chain. If we have a look at society, labour conditions, labour management systems, migrant workers, capacity building, OH&S risks, the health risks of hazardous dyes and nanomaterials. These are all impacts that various stakeholder groups identified as what was important to them. Yep, and the reason why I keep on saying the impact that was important to them is that what is important to them, again, should be very important to the throughout that value chain. So it will be important to your H&Ms, it will be important to your Gap Incs, and therefore it will be important to you as being a significant player within that supply chain. And just finally here, just a couple of other topics within this piece of research was, again, chemicals use, sourcing strategy and policies, and supplier screening. And supplier screening is a really big one. So this is, very much where you all sit, where, quite often when you are asked for information to contribute to audits, I imagine that these are some of the things that you would have to answer. So questions around labour rights, human rights, ethical conduct in the supply chain, so in the middle column here, labour and working conditions, environment, child labour, and so on. So these might seem really quite familiar to you throughout the audit process. Okay, so I've been talking about sustainability impacts. So let's delve a little bit further into this. And the reason why I'm delving further into this is that you need to know what you're going to communicate about. Yep. So anyway, so essentially there is a process for communicating what your sustainability impacts are. But first, of course, you need to understand, well, what is a sustainability impacts? What is a sustainability impact? And if we have a look at the definition up the top there, so it's an effect that an organisation has or could have, yep, on the economy, environment and people, including human rights, as a result of their activities or their business relationships. And this then indicates the contribution, which could be a negative contribution or a positive contribution to sustainability. Yep. And if we actually have a look on the right hand side here, this kind of, whoops. So this, when we're having a look at drilling down into what an impact is, this is much more than doing just a brainstorm. Impacts can be actual, so what's happening right now, or potential, what might happen. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be intended or unintended. They could be short-term impacts or long-term impacts, and they could be reversible or irreversible impacts. So these are really quite important definitions for you to try and wrap your head around there. And if we also have a look at negative impacts, these are impacts that we as businesses can cause, contribute to, or be directly linked to. Yeah, so there's quite a lot to think about when we are discussing what our impacts might be. So we can cause, contribute to, be directly linked to, etc., etc. And don't forget that we're looking way beyond our actual impacts today. Yeah, we're looking beyond our actual impacts. We're really looking at the big picture of how significant that impact could be against a whole range of different variables. Okay, so when we are having a look at how to address our negative sustainability impacts, these are the things that we need to consider. And again, we're running through these definitions here so that we know what to communicate through our sustainability communications. So if we're having a look at our potential negative impacts or our actual negative impacts, there are a number of strategies that you can employ. So for your potential negative impacts, i.e., it may or may not happen, but we certainly don't want this impact to happen. Yep. We need to think about prevention and mitigation strategies. So what will we do to stop something happening? If there is an actual negative impact, this is when we need to think about, well, how will we remedy the situation? What remediation processes will we put in place? So things for you to think about there. Okay, so again, seeing that this is a precursor to knowing what to communicate within your sustainability communications, we really need to think about well, how do we shape our sustainability impacts? We're starting to get a little bit of an idea of how to identify what our impacts might be. Yep, across a range of different variables as well. When we're looking at our most important impacts, one of the key terms that we use is materiality. So a material topic is a topic that is very, very important and has the most significant impact on the economy, the environment and people, including on human rights. So if we get rid of all of the jargon, when we talk about what's material to your organization, it is simply the most important and significant impacts that you have on these three variables here. So we have a number of steps that we need to undertake to be able to identify our most important or material impacts. Yep. So we need to understand the bigger picture. What is our system? What is the sustainability context? And that's something I could talk about for hours. But in fact, when we're talking about our sustainability context, we're looking at the geopolitical environment, environmental impacts, social impacts, what's happening at the local level, the national level, the international level. Where does your organization sit within the broader context of sustainability? And that's where you really need to understand your business and how you relate to other businesses within the value chain and also within the world. Yeah. We need to identify and assess our impacts, and then we need to prioritize our most significant impacts. And generally speaking, when we are prioritizing our most significant impacts, these are the ones that you are going to communicate. Yep. So when we're communicating sustainability, we don't come up with a list of, say, 30 topics and report on all of them. That's actually not the way that we do it. We identify a long list of potential important or material topics, and then we drill down and prioritize to a top 10 to 12 topics that is the most important or has the most significant impact. And that's how we prioritize. And these are the things that we report on. And we do this through engaging with our stakeholders. Okay, so what is your role in communicating sustainability? So, okay, well, there is actually quite a lot to it, and it's very, very important. When we're having a look at issues such, well, you're all in business here, and you want to stay in business. So, essentially, when we are communicating sustainability, there are, a number of things that we need to consider. In terms of so such as building trust with your buyers and suppliers. So not just you as the supplier to the retailer, but also your own suppliers as well. So trust is a really, really big. It's a really such an important thing to be able to nurture through business, so that you do have these long-standing relationships. The introduction of open communication with your buyers. So this is actually something that you can start thinking about. Instead of just responding to when they ask for information for their own audits, for example. So, the data for various environmental impacts or various social impacts. Why not provide them with information that's bigger than that? Yeah, so initiate open communication with your buyers. One of the main things that you really do need to do is to this third point here is actually understanding what your own impacts are as a business on the economy, environment, and people, including their human rights. So you need to start somewhere. You do really need to, rather than just, I guess, cherry picking the data or the information that is required through those audits, is think about this through very much strategic lens. Rather than that tactical lens. So rather than just responding, really get into what your sustainability strategy would look like. Yeah. And therefore, identifying what your most material impacts are and what you can then communicate to your buyers, for example. We're also wanting to share quality sustainability metrics with your buyer. And there are a number of steps to that as well. But in terms of getting your data systems in place, this is incredibly important as well. And probably most importantly, we're actually wanting to mitigate, prevent, and reduce our sustainability risks throughout the supply chain. Yep, which benefits all entities within that global value chain. These are some of the key things that we are definitely need to think about. Okay, so what would we say is the value of communicating sustainability? So we have both internal benefits and external benefits here as well. And, it's interesting, I could be delivering this presentation to one of your buyers, or I could be delivering this to you, which I am right now. And the internal and external benefits are pretty much the same. Yeah. So in terms of really understanding sustainability within your organisation, it will help you to set your vision and strategy for sustainability. So do you have one? If you already have one, does it actually fit? Does it, is it fit for purpose in this current day and age? It'll allow you to measure your performance more effectively, manage risks, and also motivate your employees. And the external benefits here, of course, is that building reputation and trust. Once there is, once the trust has been eroded, that can be very, very difficult to build back up. The attraction of capital, as in finance, is incredibly important. Your communication of sustainability gives you a framework for engaging with stakeholders, and also whichever regulatory requirements you might have, both at that governmental level and also at the sector level. and also through, you know, complying throughout that sustainability supply chain. It'll allow you to comply with all of those requirements as well. So when we're talking about what types of communication, is benefited here, we're generally talking about reporting through a recognized standard or framework that, you know, that will give you these benefits should you run through that process. Okay. And some of these standards and frameworks, and there are so many more, it's really quite a feast of standards and frameworks around sustainability at the moment. But some of the most recognised sustainability reporting standards and frameworks are these ones here. So I've mentioned the Global Reporting Initiative already, and the GRI standards are actually considered to be world's best practice and the most popular. And the good thing about the GRI standards is I think it might be in the coming year or so, they will be bringing out a sector disclosure for the apparel industry, which will be quite exciting. So hopefully I know that it is on their first priority list, but things can happen a little bit slowly sometimes as they are a not-for-profit. So keep an eye out for the GRI sector disclosure on apparel over the next 12 to 18 months or so. Some of you may have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are also a very topical framework, I suppose. They're not a standard, but they are a framework for enabling governments and businesses to be able to contribute positively to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. So that's something that you might be familiar with. And then others I've just mentioned here as well, the Value Reporting Foundation, which includes the SASB standards and the International Integrated Reporting Council framework, the TCFD, which is a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This is starting to gain quite a bit of traction, and the CDP, which is it used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. But if you are deciding to start communicating your sustainability impacts, I would recommend that you start off with the Global Reporting Initiative, as it is the most robust, and it takes you through a step-by-step process, and it covers off every element that you need to know. So these are some of the tools that are available for you. Okay, so how do we start? We know so much already now. So how do we start? There are a number of so what is our process? So look, this is a process that is, you know, something that look, it's not particularly generic. I mean, this is all about project management, really, when you're starting something new, isn't it? So if we're starting to think about communicating sustainability, what is it that you need to know? And so there are these 6 key steps that that have been identified here. So we look at our preparations and project management. We look at how to engage with your stakeholders. How do we identify your most significant impacts or what's material? Collecting data or that evidence. So you need to provide quality evidence of your sustainability performance, developing the content, and then communicating your sustainability performance. Okay, so let's just drill down a little bit further into each of these, and again, just thinking about this from a practical viewpoint. So in the preparations and project management step, there are a number of very important things that need to happen. So again, we need to first of all assess what it is that we want to do as far as our sustainability communications. So are we wanting to use a standard or a framework? You know, we might choose to use a standard or a framework that is the same as what our buyers are using. For example, you know, they might be using the GRI standards, they might be using the Sustainable Development Goals as part of their strategy, they might be using SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So would it make sense, and this is something that you would need to decide, would it make sense for you to aim to report to that same framework so that your information can then easily feed into their data, into their reporting? Okay, benchmarking and gap analysis. It's always good to know where you sit amongst your peers. and I'm not just talking about your peers, within your own geographies, for example. It always pays to look further afield. Most importantly is getting internal buy-in, and we are actually going to drill down into these ones here, because these are some of the most fundamentals. Setting up the project and reporting team, which must be cross-departmental to work the best that it can, and also holding kick-off and other meetings as well. Okay, so let's just have a look at this first point here. So assessing the sustainability reporting requirements and initiatives, you would always start off with with finding out more about what is available to you. So I've provided you with, a group of various sustainability standards and frameworks, but there are many, many more. So, my advice is for you to really have a look at what is applicable from a sector standard, from a sustainability standard, what your buyers are actually using, and so on and so on. Also think about, well, what current legislation do you need to abide by, and other compliance mechanisms for your sector. So these are absolutely integral to inputting into your sustainability reporting, and so on and so on. And then work out what's best for you. So it might seem like it's such a big step to start communicating your sustainability reporting by jumping into using a standard such as the GRI standards, but there are always options for you. So for example, with the GRI standard and the GRI standards 2021, you have the option, for example, of reporting in accordance with the standards or complying with the standards, or having a GRI reference report for a limited amount of time. So if you're just, dipping your toe into the water, for example, and wanting to see how for example, one of your see how the GRI might actually work for you, then consider, because it is one of the world's best practice, because it is the world's best practice sustainability reporting standard, can you maybe aim for a reference report, just so that you're starting to use a recognized framework? Yep, that's really important. It's measuring apples with apples, really, isn't it? That's what we're trying to get at. If we have a look at benchmarking and gap analysis, this is always a good idea. I won't go into every point here because we've got some more important points to consider a little bit later. So anyway, benchmarking and gap analysis. So that is always just good to know where you fit within the bigger picture as far as sustainability and sustainability reporting. Internal buy-in. This is absolutely critical, and it is one of the hardest things to do as well. So to get internal buy-in, you do need to engage with all levels of management. You need to make sure that there are going to be adequate resources that are allocated to your sustainability communications project, and also engage with the board if there is one, or the most senior decision-making committee that is available there. So internal buy-in is absolutely critical. So if the emphasis comes from the top down, then that's absolutely fantastic. And sometimes there isn't that level of knowledge at that very, very senior level around sustainability. It's changing because there is so much focus on that from a global perspective now, but sometimes they may need a little bit of education as well. So internal buy-in, incredibly important. Practical things such as setting up a project and reporting team. So look, one of the things that I've found over the years is that, and it's still really, really common, even here in Australia, the sustainability team is a team of one, which is not ideal. So we're wanting to spread the sustainability love around, essentially, and make sure that we do have input from various cross departments across the business there. So can we, and this will all depend upon your resourcing and getting that internal buy-in, but can there actually be a special function set up for sustainability management if it isn't already? Quite often what we find, and it's still very much the case here in Australia, depending upon what business even individual company you're looking at, the responsibility for sustainability communications might fall within the environment group, it might fall within the public affairs group, it might fall within the legal group, it might fall, within such a diverse range of departments that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But that's the legacy bit of a legacy in terms of reporting. But if you possibly can, set up a function or a unit for sustainability management. See if you can coordinate with other reporting activities. So for example, there will most likely already be some kind of annual reporting that is happening. So would it make sense to be able to, incorporate all of those in together? Identify who needs to be involved in this reporting process. Yeah, so so it will be more than one person. You're going to be looking at both the environmental and the social impacts across your organisation, and knowledge is spread across your organisation. And also think about whether or not training in sustainability is needed for your communications. Yep. Okay, kick-off meetings and other internal meetings. This is just basic project management stuff, so we won't really go too much into that, but absolutely things to consider. Secondly, engaging with your stakeholders. So this is one of the key elements of identifying what your most significant impacts are. Yep. So it is. So we don't give it justice here in this short presentation here, but it is one of the critical elements of working out what you are going to communicate as far as sustainability impacts go. But some of the key things that you need to think about is, have a look around and see how others are doing it. You will need to again, create a long list of who your stakeholder groups would be. And of course, in this case, right up at the top, I mean, in the context of what we're talking about, they would be your customers, your buyers, up at the very top. Then you would have your employees, for example. Then you would have other people further on down the supply chain, etc. So anyway, so who are your stakeholder groups, and can you prioritize them? What will your engagement plan look like? And then so on. Okay, this is a really big topic here as well. So again, we're just going at a very, very top level here as well. So how do we identify our most significant impacts? So desktop research, see what is important to your customers, etc. What are other organizations, what are your peers reporting on? Have a look internally. Have a look at, what your company stands for, what data you're collecting at the moment. Have a look at, information that your stakeholders actually what they told you, and have a go at good old-fashioned things such as once you've identified these topics, what are the risks and opportunities for each of these available to you for each of these impacts here, and then very, very importantly, and we just you can run an entire workshop on materiality, but work out how what that threshold will be to identify what your most material topics are. Okay, now this is incredibly important here. Again, going back to the point that you are being asked for data for audits from your, from the fashion retailers, etc. It's so important to be able to collect this evidence and communicate this evidence as well. So essentially, when we're communicating our sustainability impacts, environmental and social sustainability impacts, we're providing evidence to our stakeholders that of our performance. So whether or not we are improving in our performance, whether or not we are lagging in our performance, whether or not we're just kind of standing still, because what we're trying to do is continuously improve and reduce our negative impacts across environmental and social sustainability. So data is one of the most problematic areas of sustainability reporting, I have to say. So having a look at data validation, and there are a whole bunch of principles as well, which are used in the GRI standards that will guide you in terms of data validation and verifiability and comparability and all of those kinds of things there. Okay, so you've done all the hard work now. So now well, not really quite. We've done a lot of the foundational work. So now we're developing the content. So having a look at things such as, what will your communications look like? Who needs to be involved in your sustainability communications and reporting? What's the narrative? What will you talk about within your report? How will you position all of this information there? Do you have all of the data, both qualitative and quantitative, and so on and so on? So, so developing content is certainly not the easiest part by any means, and you will find that there will be draft after draft after draft of your report, but that is just the way that things go. Better to get things right so then you can actually have a very quality sustainability communications piece that you can then submit to your buyers. Okay, and communicating. So, okay, so these are some of the key things that we need to have a look at, and there are quite a number of considerations here. So again, we need to know who our stakeholders are. So when we communicate our sustainability performance, we're looking at our buyers, our employees. This information that you are gathering for this sustainability impact information that you're gathering for your buyers can have a range of applications. It can be incredibly valuable for investors if you are after some capital raising. It can be very useful for government for compliance reasons, for NGOs that might be holding a lens to your business as well. If you are providing quality sustainability information, then it should be and it can be validated, verified, it's comparable, etc., then you should be able to use this piece of information across a whole range of different stakeholder groups, not just your buyers. So there's a real value in that. Other things to consider, what's your budget for communications? We'd like to think we all have a really big budget, but we don't. And what kind of communication channels would you use to communicate your sustainability information? So is it going to be a report? Is it going to be a webinar? What kind of, could you hold some events to showcase to your buyers or, those within your supply chain what your sustainability performance look like? Can you, present at conferences, for example, on your environmental and social sustainability impacts and so on? So how will you do this? It's pretty important stuff. And, it's really important. One of the things that I will say, it's really important to know that you're not going to get this sustainability you're not going to be happy with your sustainability communications or performance in the first year, or there will always be something that you can find that you're not really quite happy with. But that's absolutely okay, because what this reporting is about, it's about transparency and it's about accountability. Yeah, these are the two key things that we really need to have as a overarching theme. We're being transparent to our stakeholders and we're being accountable for our environmental and social sustainability impacts. Yep. Okay. All right. So we have actually covered off all of these things here. So we've talked about sustainability. We've looked at the impacts in the fashion industry and specifically in the textile garment sector. We've talked about the value chain. We've looked at some of your potential customers and what's important to them in terms of their sustainability impacts. We've looked at how to address sustainability impacts, the value of communicating sustainability, and the tools, and also just a few tips there in terms of how to get started. So that's actually it from me.
Thank you very much,
Probably right on an hour, isn't it, Stephen?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
That's okay.
Everyone can just give a bit of virtual applause to Marianne for that. Marianne, the word that I heard most often during this talk was impact.
Yes.
And when we think of impacts, you used the term several times, negative impacts.
Yep.
Now, in the early days of CSR reporting, we now call it sustainability, okay, but in the early days of CSR reporting, quite a few companies that did a CSR report looked at it as a public relations exercise. So yeah. CSR as public relations, as an advertisement for the good things that we're doing. Yes. Now, how do you balance that talking about your impacts and your negative impacts while also trying to get across, do you want a report that's telling H&M or Zara or Lululemon, oh yeah, everything's going to hell in my factory? Of course you don't want that, right? I mean, how do you balance the negative impacts with a positive story or a narrative?
Yeah.
How do
Oh,
you
look,
do that?
absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and apologies if I did just paint that negative picture. I just finished off running a human rights course, so
Understood.
that was quite depressing. We only talk about negative impacts. So yes, absolutely. So we do talk about our positive impacts as well. If we're, if you choose to use a tool such as the GRI standards, for example, one of their principles is one of balance. And so basically what that is looking at is having a look at not just the positive but also the negative. And the reason why that is spelt out is that, historically many reports have, have erred towards greenwashing, etc., and only talking about the good stuff. So it's certainly not about either focusing on all of the good stuff and not omitting all of the negative information, and it's certainly not the other way around either. So there is that absolute principle of balance that you do need to address. So once you have identified what your most significant impacts are, we do look at that from a positive and a negative perspective as well. So we don't just look at the negative. We also
Yeah.
look at the positive there. Yeah.
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 One of the other things you mentioned that I totally endorse was legislation. That if we go back 20 years, CSR reporting or sustainability reporting was voluntary. Um, companies did it because they thought there was some sort of benefit in it. But today, it's increasingly moving from the voluntary area into a mandatory area, and I think we've got mandatory human rights due diligence, which is of fundamental importance to every factory sitting in on this call. We've got the German legislation that'll be coming up next year. We've got the EU that's just released a draft in the last couple of weeks on supply chain law. We've got the New York Fashion Sustainability Act, which is still in draft form, but that's under debate in the US. California is starting to look at something like the New York Sustainable Fashion Act. We've got Norway, we've got France, we've got Australia with the anti-slavery. So sustainability has really moved from a set of voluntary activities moving much more towards legal. And then on top of that, we've also got investors paying increasing attention to not only what H&M is doing, but what H&M's suppliers are doing, just to use H&M
Yes.
as an example. Could you
Yeah.
talk a bit more about how you see the rise of legislation and the importance of that for reporting?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I think it's very, very piecemeal. So it depends upon the country. It depends upon the country, and it depends upon the topic. So if we look at human rights, for example, yes, that is finally getting the attention that it deserves. In Australia, there was we're now into our third year of third cycle, for example, of modern slavery statement preparation. But even then, so it doesn't matter if, sorry, I'll get back to that point. Yeah. So, so look, I think it's really quite piecemeal and very topic specific. I mean, we have environmental legislation here, and I know that, environmental legislation very much differs from country to country. Environmental legislation here in Australia is really quite strong. But then once you do head into a number of, other countries, there may be legislation there, but the adherence to legislation may not necessarily be, as good as it could be, for example. So there is, I mean, the good thing is that the focus on sustainability is absolutely rising. Whether or not, and I probably do just sound very negative. I mean, I think it is piecemeal, but there are pieces that are coming together that do address human rights and they do address environment. It's still not that really, large, overarching, holistic framework that we would like to see. And as far as sustainability reporting goes, I know that I should have done some research actually. I forgot to do this research as to which countries are represented on this call actually, and whether or not sustainability reporting is legislated, because it's not legislated here in Australia. Our government is very, very slow, has been very, very slow, and hasn't really done.
No, none of the
It's done nothing.
countries. No.
So none of the countries require sustainability reporting here, because I know that there is, there's a lot of influence. Yes, so yeah, I think China, Japan, etc. I'll have to go back and do some research there, but there are a number of countries across the Asia Pac region now that do have to do, it's mandatory sustainability reporting. Actually, there is an increasing focus, as you say, by investors, and that's really happened over the last 24 months or so, I've noticed. So across all sectors that I've worked with, the interest has been phenomenal. In fact, organizations are having to employ additional people to field all these questions from from the investor and analyst group. So that's really quite interesting. And also just the expectations if you are a listed company. So I'm not quite sure how many listed companies would be on this call here as well, by a lot of the stock exchanges around the world.
Yes.
Big focus on sustainability.
You mentioned very briefly, but I'd like to come back to it, that the GRI is planning to release a sector disclosure for apparel. Can you just explain a little bit about what that is?
Yes, absolutely. So, okay, so what sector disclosure is, so just to give you a little bit of an overview, so the GRI standards themselves are a standard for all sectors across the world, and they include a set of universal standards, and then they also include like a suite of economic, social, and environmental standards. So that altogether makes up the GRI standards, which are expected to be applicable to all sectors everywhere. However, there are actually industries, of course, such as apparel, which do have, and every industry has their own specific, pain points, I suppose, or material impacts is what I should probably say, which are unique to them. So with the release of the GRI Standards 2021, there are only two sector disclosures so far which have been released, which is for oil and gas and just last week for coal. There is a very, very long list of sectors that will be targeted for the sector disclosures, including apparel. And so what these sector disclosures are, they're very, very in-depth, as a matter of fact, and they will run through, give a contextual background of, the entire apparel value chain, for example. It will look at economic, environment, and people impacts very much from that specific apparel perspective, apparel, textile, garment industry perspective. So impacts that, someone that other organizations, they're just not relevant for other organizations. So it's very, very specific to you. And so those impacts, and there are actually additional disclosures or indicators within those sector disclosures that are complementary to the GRI standards. So once that apparel sector disclosure does come out, if you are reporting to the GRI standards, you will have to use both of those together. Yeah, so it's very, very specific on, on industry specific impacts.
And when you say indicators, those indicators are essentially requests for data.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
How much water are you recycling? How many accidents and injuries in your factory in the last 12 months?
Exactly. That's right.
So they're very specific. And the apparel sector disclosure from the GRI will be asking questions that are very specifically related to the apparel and textile sector.
Yes, absolutely. So they won't necessarily be applicable to other industry sectors at all. So, just to give you an example, the oil and gas sector disclosure, it's about 80 to 90 pages of not just disclosures, but such an in-depth. I'm really quite impressed actually. So just such an interesting and in-depth background to the industry, why it matters, an entire context of the history, how things have changed, and and then what those impacts might be, and then what might be material to that particular sector. So they're very, very in depth. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the apparel industry disclosure coming out.
So what would your advice be to a company that hasn't disclosed any information on negative or positive impacts.
Yeah.
Maybe hasn't really looked at what their major clients are doing with
Yeah.
sustainability. They haven't looked at you showed H&M, Inditex, Lululemon, etc.
Yeah.
So haven't really looked at those reports. And it's leaving this call and thinking, all right, this is probably something that we really need to look into this and think about how to get going on this. What would
Yeah.
be the time? What would be the timeline in your experience? Consulting with companies in that position of having nothing in place to
Yeah.
being able to communicate something relatively substantial. How long? What? You said it's a long term, but can you give a kind of a
Yeah,
figure
that's a
on
really
that?
good question because it's easy enough for me to talk about this, isn't it? But I do work with a lot of companies actually who are just starting out in their sustainability reporting. So I would be really looking at a 6 to 12 month period in preparation. So really getting to know. So those steps that we ran through, steps 1 to 3 would have covered those off before we get on to developing report content, is really to do a good bit of research into, what your buyers are reporting. So, really get familiar with the process. That could be a little bit daunting because they are very shiny reports, so, and it's not necessarily the aim for you as beginner reporters to publish such a shiny report at the very, very, very beginning, but just have a look at what they're at the content of what they're reporting. Yeah, and then run through that process and have a look at the frameworks in terms of, the GRI standards, for example. Like that will set you on your way. And I know that, like I'm certainly not, well, I don't mean to push the GRI standards, but for any beginner, that's where you start. That's actually where you start because they do provide you with that step-by-step process in determining how to report and what to report. Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out here also that the GRI does run a pretty extensive a set of training programs.
Yeah, they do.
For beginners and companies starting out. So
yeah.
I think it's important. You sort of talk about beginner versus the glossy reports of the Nikes and the H&Ms. Nike's been reporting for over 20 years. Nike has a team of
thousands.
Not quite thousands, but they have a big team, right? And and they work all year on this. And
yes.
As soon as they publish one report, they're working on the next year, and
that's
right.
right.
So it's just a continuous process. But I think it's important for all the companies on this. If you haven't reported, not to be intimidated by picking up a 200-page Inditex report or looking at some glossy, fantastic web-based interactive report for a big $5 billion multinational company. But I think the real point here is that you mentioned transparency and accountability, and I think any report, even if you're a manufacturer and anything going, our report doesn't look very good. The point is that it's sending a message of we are being transparent, we're communicating on our impacts, positive and negative, we're embarking on a journey, and that's the message you're sending to your clients. And I think that message is extremely important to show that you're being active in maintaining and building the relationship. And any report that or any communication that lands, that gets, you send it by email or whatever to your contact in H&M or Lululemon or Primark or whoever. When the sustainability manager in Primark opens the email and sees a communication from a factory in Pakistan or Bangladesh or Vietnam that is a supplier, and there's a report, their first response is going to be, wow, that's great. I don't see many of these.
Mm.
And I think this is the opportunity for suppliers to communicate. It's so don't be intimidated and think, oh, my report is very small and looks very meek against these big boys. That's not the point. The point is to embark on a pathway to building a relationship around transparency and accountability, and showing that you're transparent, you're accountable, and you're willing to work with your clients to do better and build that over the years. Because it took, Nike's first CSR reports, I'm sure they look back at them and think, what were we doing? They weren't fantastic. But everyone's got to start somewhere, and I would encourage everybody to keep that in mind.
Look, absolutely. And if you do use a best practice framework, it's not about how big the report is. It's got to be a focused report. This is the thing. It's you don't want a 200-page report. You actually don't. One of the Australian clients that I've worked with over the last couple of years, so they have only just they published I've worked with them for 2 years in a row, actually, and they're the kind of company that just doesn't want to spend any money on design. So we've got a really good, the report content is really good. It follows the GRI standards to a T. It's very much a journey for them in terms of understanding their sustainability impacts and knowing that they need to improve their disclosure year on year. And the first year it was a simple Word document. I mean, I felt a bit uncomfortable about that, just because it didn't look as nice as, every other report that I've worked on. But that's what they wanted, and they were just very pragmatic and saying, we're getting asked for this information. Here is the information, and you can't argue with that. So and the second year wasn't much. The second year was just, I think it was zipped up in a PDF. But in a nicer template. So, the information was all there is what I'm getting at. And, it was a 40 to 50 page Word document, essentially, with all of the essential information on their most material impacts. It did the job.
Yeah, it's not a public relations document.
It can be a public relations document.
Of course it can be, but but I think it's well worth thinking of it as it's
a strategic document. It should be a strategic document. Yeah, absolutely.
We're just about coming to the end, but in the chat box, we've got a feedback form. If you've got a minute to spare, just click on the link to the feedback form. It helps us, build these technical seminars to make them better and better. This is our first one. We've got one coming up next month on grievance mechanisms. We'll be sending out an invitation for that shortly. I've just, Mr. Chowdhury has put a very interesting comment in the box. It looks like his company has already, they've been reporting using GRI since 2014. And he says, from our experience, the first report will be the challenging one. And I think no truer word has been spoken about sustainability reporting.
Look, absolutely.
He said you get more into a system for the later ones. And I think you talked about metrics and data systems, and I think that's that really.
Yeah. Although I will say, Mr. Chowdhury, quite often I've actually found that the second one is the most difficult, because the first one you've
that's another issue. Yeah.
You've told your amazing story, etc. So what will you talk about in the second one? So no, the first one is actually really very challenging, because you are just working out your what your systems and processes are, and you do get into a system. One thing I found, if you've been reporting since 2014, as you say, keeping the report fresh can be really quite difficult as well. is something that I find, you know. I don't know if you
Yeah,
agree, but
that's a yeah. I know I've written reports for companies over 4 or 5 years, and you're correct. And I think one of the ways of dealing with that is to focus on a theme. Perhaps focus on a theme every year, so there's more attention paid on a particular theme. You've got information, but you focus on a particular area that you've been working
yeah,
on,
possibly.
over the previous year, or you ensure that you are showing improvements in your impacts.
Yeah.
So if you've had negative impacts, that you've been able to start dealing with those and start showing with data and with your metrics that you've been able to deal with those. But thanks very much for that, Mr. Chowdhury. That's a bang on point. Marianne, we are right on 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Well, at 5 o'clock my end, we're right on 90 minutes. Sorry, we're right on the 90 minutes.
Okay.
So we have to wrap it up here.
Sure.
If you have got time with the feedback form, please just look in the chat box, and you'll see a link to the feedback for Technical Seminar 1. As I say, this is the first technical seminar from GIZ Fabric in a series. Next month is on grievance mechanisms. Grievance mechanisms will become increasingly important, particularly if your clients are in Germany just immediately, because the German due diligence law does have a specific stipulation about grievance mechanisms. But we can expect from the EU draft, when the EU finally legislates for that, that will also have very clear articles in the law about the requirements for grievance mechanisms. So, so late next month, in April, we'll be looking at the kind of the types of grievance mechanisms, and what good practice or best practice, so, between good and best practice looks like under each one of those kinds of systems that you could develop and ensure you have in your factory. That's all from us today. Thank you once again to Marianne, who comes to us from northern New South Wales in Australia, and it's getting on towards well into the evening there. Thank you very much for your time, Marianne, and thank you
that's
all,
a pleasure.
everyone for attending from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and etc. Thank you all very much, and I hope we see you next time for grievance mechanisms. That's all from us. Stay safe and goodbye. Thank you.